chocolate coconut tart. This is a really easy yet fancy dessert recipe I came up with while experimenting with coconut fats. Coconut oil makes beautifully crumbly pastry crusts, and coconut cream makes an exceptionally smooth chocolate ganache with a cooling mouthfeel. And totally incidentally, this recipe is vegan. That's just a bonus as far as I'm concerned. I wasn't trying to make it vegan. First thing is make the crust. It's something between a short crust pastry and a crumbly cracker crust. Like a cup of all-purpose flour, 120 grams, but this is not a fussy pastry. It does not have to be precise. Half a cup of sugar, 100 grams, and then like 50 grams or half a cup of almond flour for some extra flavor and crumbly texture, though you could use an equivalent amount of coconut shreds, for example. If you want to double down on the coconut thing, you could replace this with just more AP flour, or if you have celiac, you could use solid almond flour for this. Now, you could use cold butter, but I'm using coconut oil. Virgin coconut oil like this gets you a nice subtle coconut flavor. Refined coconut oil will have almost no flavor at all, and it should be solid like this at room temperature. If it's not solid, your kitchen is probably too warm. Chill the oil in the fridge before you cut it into the dough. It needs to be solid. I've got half a cup of coconut fat in there. That's 8 tablespoons, about 110 grams. Last thing is salt. I like to have a nice salty crust on a chocolate tart. Half a teaspoon of Morton kosher is what I'm using. That's 2 or 3 grams. You could use more. And you could throw all that into the food processor and just pulse it until it's like a coarse breadcrumb consistency, or you could do it the old-fashioned way with a pastry cutter or a fork. You just cut the tines of the fork into the big chunks of solid fat. As you cut those chunks into smaller chunks, they immediately get covered in flour and such, which disperses the fat bits. It keeps them from sticking together again. It'll feel like you're doing absolutely nothing, but keep at it, and all of a sudden you'll have that coarse breadcrumb consistency. If you can squeeze it and it just barely holds a solid shape, that is done. That is what gives you a crumbly or short pastry. If you want something a little more flaky, you can pick up handfuls of this and do that with them. Just squeeze out long sheets of fat coated in flour, aka flakes. But this will still be pretty crumbly because we're not actually going to roll this out, and because there's no water in this dough. Coconut oil is nearly 100% fat, unlike butter, which is like 15% water. That water reacts with gluten to make a more elastic dough. There's no water at all in this, so this pastry is going to be super brittle, which is what I'm after. It's like a graham cracker crust. And you could simply mold this into a normal pie or cake pan. It'll be delicious, but you would not be able to cut out nice, pretty slices. For that, you need a tart pan with a removable bottom. These things are cheap, and you can just lift the tart up out of the pan when it's done. My recipe is calibrated for this pretty standard 9-inch diameter size, 23 centimeters, or it could work with 4 of these mini guys that I'm going to use, 4.5 inches wide. With these little ones, each person gets their own tart, and there's more edge crust relative to the total volume, which means fewer bites will be exactly the same. Heterogeneity. I'm just pushing the crumbs into the molds. My recipe gives you a very thick crust layer. It's equal parts crust and ganache because that's what I'm into. You could make less crust if you wanted. Try to push it into the corners and make sure it's not too thick down there in the corner. It's going to melt a bit in the oven and slump down into the corner. So if it's too thin in the corners when it goes in the oven, it'll be just right on the way out. You could use a measuring cup or a glass or something to really stamp these out smooth, but I don't think that makes a really noticeable difference in the end. And there's the 4 tartlets. How was that not the name of a Motown group? We'll bake them empty at 350 Fahrenheit, 180 C. Baking them on a tray will make it easier to get them out when they're hot, and the tray will catch any melting pastry that would otherwise fall and burn. Now, there's nothing really to do but clean up. Might as well listen to some tunes by this remarkable undiscovered talent on SoundCloud. I mean, wow. And he sounds great via the sponsor of this video, Cove Audio, whom I'll now briefly thank. This is the Cove Commuter 2, just the best darn Bluetooth speaker you can imagine. It syncs with your phone or computer or whatever in a flash. The controls are really simple and obvious, and I wonder how this visionary SoundCloud composer would sound in true wide stereo. That's how. Amazing. There's a 30-foot range between these two halves. You can charge them simultaneously, up to 7 hours of playtime on a charge. It's water resistant, which is great for kitchen use. There's a built-in microphone, and it gets darn loud, apart or reunited. If you follow my link in the description, you can save more than 67% on the Commuter 2, making it far more affordable than any comparable speaker I've seen. And remember, it's basically a 2-for-1 deal because it has 2 speakers. Link is in the description for 67% off. Thank you, Cove. After After 15 or 20 minutes, the pastry shells should be kind of molten and bubbly. This is not the kind of pastry that will stick all the way up the sides of the tart pan, so don't expect it to. You could pull these right now, or you could bake them a little longer until they brown a bit. The browning tastes delicious, but it can also drown out the subtle flavor of the coconut, and it can make the pastry harder to cut with a fork. Pick your poison. I will say, if you want a stronger coconut flavor, you could add a few drops of coconut flavoring to the dough or the ganache. I tried that, I liked it, but Lauren thought it tasted like sunscreen. Anyway, you gotta let these cool all the way down before you fill them. Wait until they're ready, then make the ganache filling. You could use a product labeled coconut milk or coconut cream. I'm using the cream. It's the same stuff as the milk, except it will have more of this luscious fat floating in the can above the layer of coconut water at the bottom. And I'm just lifting the semi-solid cream out of the can and dropping it into a microwave-safe measuring jug. I'm looking for 1 cup's worth, 240 mils. If you don't have enough of the cream to get you that much, you can top it off with the coconut water you've left behind. That's fine. The more coconut water you have in there, the more soft the ganache will be, which is not an inherently good or bad thing. Now for the chocolate. It's the star of the show, so use a chocolate you really like, either chips or chop up a bar into chunks. Ganache is generally equal parts cream, traditionally dairy cream, of course, and chocolate. You can easily measure that volume of the chocolate by displacement. Just mix in enough that you've got 2 total cups of stuff in there, almost 500 mils, but it does not have to be precise. Easiest way to make ganache is to just throw it in a microwave on like half power for a minute or two, just long enough until you can melt it together. I usually wait until I see the first signs of melting chocolate and then I take it out and stir. It should look like it's not quite hot enough yet, because if you keep stirring it and spreading around the heat, it will go smooth at a surprisingly low temperature. This is good, because if you get it too hot, it can kind of seize up and go grainy. Taste it. You could call that done, or you could put in a little dab of vanilla or almond extract or any flavoring you like. You might also want it sweeter, depending on your tastes and how dark your chocolate was to begin with. You can stir in a little granulated sugar, but it's safer to squeeze in a little syrup. Any syrup. Granulated sugar could give you a gritty texture. Don't make it too sweet, because the crust is plenty sweet. I think the filling should taste a little too intensely chocolatey in isolation. This last step will be a lot easier if you do it directly in the fridge. You just fill the tarts all the way to the brim. It doesn't matter if you go higher than your walls of crust. Filling these in the fridge saves you from having to transfer them in while they're full and soft and sloshing around. You would spill a lot. Look how pretty that is. And then just chill these until they're solid, a couple hours at least, but they'll be firmer if you chill them overnight, like I did. There they are the next day. Now, these are too cold for you to push the tart up out of its ring right now. The crust and ganache is still stuck to the sides. Get yourself a wide, flat vessel and pour in a thin layer of hot tap water. Stick the tart in there, and within seconds, that will melt the stuff clinging to the ring, and you can easily lift the tart out. Get a knife in there to lever off the bottom piece, or don't bother, just serve it right on the base. That water trick works great. If you just left these on the counter until soft, the whole tart would be too warm by the time you could depan it. You could put some raspberries or something on there for fancy, or not. I prefer a light sprinkling of smoked sea salt. Crazy good. You can also tap on a little bit of powdered sugar. That's pretty, but do it right before you eat, because that thing is cold, so there's going to be condensation forming on it, which will dissolve the sugar, and that looks kind of ugly. I prefer the smoked sea salt. Now, especially if you browned the crust, it's going to be a little tough to push your fork through because it's so cold and thick. You might instead consider putting it on a cutting board and cutting it into little wedges, like a wheel of brie. Just wipe the knife clean in between each cut. This turns it into a finger food, which makes it a nice thing for people standing around at a party or something. That's just so tasty. And again, I feel like that coconut milk ganache has a cooling mouthfeel, as though it's working on my thermoreceptors the same way that something like mint does. Am I just making that up? Well, you try this recipe and you tell me.